And we're very pleased to welcome you, Paul. This is Dr. Paul Pangaro, the president of the American Society for Cybernetics, and I will let him introduce himself.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. I would like to dance a little bit and stall because inevitably people seem to come in the first 5 minutes. And as we all know from professional theater, it never starts on time. It always starts 5 minutes after. So in the spirit of professional theater, I would like to invoke that. For those of you who are curious, this URL in the chat is a PDF version of what I'll be presenting. And feel free to look at it now, look at it later. The links to various things that I'll be talking about are in that PDF, and hence that is a certain advantage. And I'll put that in the chat 1 or 2 more times. See, many people are still coming in. So we'll wait just another minute or 2 if that's okay. In the meantime, I will endeavor to begin sharing screen. Oh, I am sharing screen.
Yes, you are.
That's what we call inadvertent. So let me put it in a more reasonable state. Excellent. Yeah, okay, so there are many disadvantages here. Give me a moment, please. It's the preview version. Yeah, okay. This is the version I want. Let me Okay, I think we have a stable number of people coming. Who have come in. If anyone is coming late, here's a link to the PDF in the chat. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the opportunity. My thanks especially to Elena for the original invitation to come to you today, and to Angela, who is unable to be here today, unfortunately. And thank you, for coming in for her. Angela also generously shared some of her very lucid texts about the VSM. I know many of you, but I've been asked to give a brief introduction. I'm Paul Pangaro. I've been in the cybernetics community for many years. I joined the ASC in the 80s, where I met many, Stafford and Gordon Pask and many others. I had already met Gordon Pask. That was the origin of me in cybernetics, although I knew Jerry Letfin, who was a student of Warren McCullough before that. And I've been fascinated by the field. I can't seem to get away from it. I've been here in Detroit, wrong. I was in Detroit for 4 years. Now I'm here in Pittsburgh teaching at Carnegie Mellon. And fortunately, I'm able now to teach some of the courses that I would like to teach. And that will include systems design and cybernetics in the spring term. Yeah, that may be enough about me. You can look me up if you wish. My goal today, and I want to be very clear on this, is to present a cybernetic path from this thing called design thinking. It has its own fraught history. And that will take some time, and I appreciate your patience there. And then to make a bridge to VSM. And I think there are many benefits to this. I will certainly learn more about VSM. I'm new to it compared to those of you here. And yet I feel that VSM's power is there, and any bridge to it and bridge back from it can help, because we have these wicked problems of the world and we need all the help we can get. And I'm not trying to imply in any way that there's an equivalence of power or stature between my work and the VSM, but I think it's a conversation point that hopefully you'll agree is a valuable thing. There are some people who are not on mute. I don't know if you have the power to mute them. I appreciate it. First, I want to clarify this very self-conscious line break, designing conversations for variety. I don't think you can design a conversation. You can design four conditions for a conversation. It may seem a little pedantic, but conversations for variety is the main idea. And how do you design for those? This is the intention here. Next, I'd like to establish my credibility, my bona fides, as the old school would say, by showing you this particular photo. This was taken at a conference in 1984, although my first encounter with Stafford was a few years earlier. It was a privilege. I essentially had a one-on-one with him in the home of one of his collaborators in New York City, Michael Ben-Eli, and I won't forget that. And although my goal here is not to reminisce, I'm also fortunate in having certain artifacts that have to do with Stafford's history. This is actually from the library of Heinz von Forster, his sons, when clearing out his home in Pescadero, California. Didn't have a place to put Heinz's scientific papers. Obviously, his journals and his most important things are in Vienna. I shouldn't have said journals, I should have said books. So I have that. I also have this volume, which has a elided CyberSyn name. I don't know if you would know this. Project CyberSyn by Hermann Schwember. I hope I'm not the only person on earth who has this copy.
We're not seeing it because.
But I assure you, I'm anxious to share it. Introduction, the original idea and the statement of the problem, the structural model, CyberSyn, and the development of new structures, etc. I also have some other artifacts which I would like to share. Nilo Lindgren was an MIT professor, and he knew Warren McCullough well. And there were a series of interviews that Nilo did, including with Stafford Beer. And I don't know that these have ever seen the light of day. And here Stafford is talking about the first day he met Warren McCullough and so on. So these are artifacts to share in other contexts. But again, my goal today is not to reminisce, but rather to move forward. So let me try to accelerate here and get into it. This is a very democratic way to talk about design. Everyone designs. And if I've ever seen a cybernetic definition, it's this one. It comes from, as you may know, Herb Simon. Current state, preferred state, courses of action, detection and correction of errors. It's a purely cybernetic way of characterizing design, which I love. Herb Simon, of course, famously in his Sciences of the Artificial, relegated the mention of cybernetics to a footnote only. But here we have a greater master. Design and cybernetics are really the same thing, says Ranulph. And another is, it's the bridge between cybernetics and design. And I'm trying to establish a connection here. I think you'll see why. My colleague Hugh Doberly and I have written on this. We feel that cybernetics is a necessary foundation for 21st century design practice. And we construe design as a conversation for action. That is our cybernetics. Another great quote, Ranulph, design is the action, second order cybernetics is the explanation. Now, this isn't my main point here, but I do want to establish that this isn't just a hope or a desire. There's actually a tight logical reasoning here. If you're doing design, you have to engage in systems. The world is complex, wicked problems, et cetera, always engage systems. Even I tell students in my courses, yes, you're an interaction designer or you're an architect, but you're dealing with many other designers who design in their specialty who are embedded in systems of systems and systems. So if you were designing today, systems. If you're doing systems, you should do cybernetics, right? Because cybernetics is clearly about intention. And cybernetics should encompass, and never didn't encompass, second order, the epistemology, the framing, et cetera. And of course, if you're into second order cybernetics, then you must be engaged in conversation. I hope that doesn't require explanation. I say conversation a lot. I mean it in the sense of Gordon Pask. I worked with him, did a PhD with him, but mostly ran around with him trying to do client work and so on. And it was Hugh Dubberly who said one day to me, you know, Paul, these cybernetic models are really terrific for helping designers design, but they're also helpful for understanding the design process itself. And this is what I'm doing today. I'm looking at a design process and I'm applying a cybernetic lens, and then I will make the bridge to VSM. So this design thing is everywhere. Design thinking is everywhere. I'm not here to do a takedown of design thinking, but rather to bring variety. I'm going to assume you know what that means in this context. To bring variety to the intentions of design thinking and to make it more rigorous and powerful. So let's go from this design thinking thing to conversation. That's essentially the arc, as you've heard. So the process of design thinking, very briefly, many of you likely know this. This is again a waypoint. You observe ethnographically, you understand what's going on in the situation, hopefully in a semi-rigorous way, qualitative way, anthropological way. Then you brainstorm open-endedly, and then you make a test. This is the way it's usually construed. Now, not much is said in design thinking about how you evaluate each one of these steps, or based on your evaluation, how you iterate on it, how you do it again and again and make it better and better each time. I can hear Heinz von Forster saying, you don't mean iterate, you mean recurse, because recursion is a spiral, iteration is, in its original meaning at least, more of a repetition. So some limitations here. How specific and rigorous and repeatable are these steps? How much is it a methodology and how much is it, you know, just something to do? That's too disparaging. I don't really mean it. But I'm concerned about rigor and about limitations here. And in this process of iteration and evaluation, how clear is it? Quantifiable and directed, quantifiable in a good sense, not overly quantified. So if we were to rethink this, let's look at each step. And I have a proposal for each of these steps toward the cybernetic frame. I would say that instead of thinking about it as just research or just observation, I think of it as design for conversation. And this will be a major theme today. So if I'm engaged with other people, whether I'm doing research with them or I'm brainstorming with them or I'm prototyping with them, how do I think about the conversation process and how do I design conversations for variety? So this is one little excursion here. So imagine a conversation in which these little tiny red things are people, participants, and there can be many of them. So presumably the conversation builds new knowledge and we can say, well, what do we learn? Okay, great. Now, what do we do next? Do we just bring the same people into the room again and keep going? Or do we examine it a little more carefully and have a stronger plan? For example, we might ask ourselves, after we ask, what did we learn? We might ask ourselves, what questions do we need to answer next? Seems obvious. This whole thing will probably, you'll go, oh yeah, I get that. But codifying it in this way seems useful. Clients have told me so. They go, wow, yeah, can I have that on a placemat on my desk? True story. So these questions that we want to answer next establish the goal for the next conversation, which leads to the question, who should be in the next conversation? And the standard answer, at least in American corporate culture, is the same people who were in the prior conversation, unless they can't come for some reason, right? Because they're sick or they have a conflict or they have better things to do, right? But the presumption is the team is the team and we just carry it through. Well, we want to question that in this. We want to ask about the variety of each conversation and who do we need in the conversation. So if we question the need for the same people each time, and we substitute that with the idea of what variety do we need in each conversation to answer the questions that we've queued up, then these participants of the first conversation become possible participants only. And then we have these two new questions. Who can we continue to use who are still essential? And what expertise do we need to add? Who else do we add? What variety do we need? So we need a selection mechanism for determining who's in the next conversation. And that selection mechanism comes from the knowledge that we just generated in conversation number one, let's call it, which determines criteria for the selection mechanism. And we may be pulling in other external information as a consequence of that first conversation. And this feeds the next conversation. So this selection mechanism becomes key. It becomes the way of looking at and deciding on the variety needed for the next conversation. It's only a prediction, right? It's not perfect. It's likely to be wrong, but it's better than saying we had those people before, all we need is the same people now. And of course, this is fractal. The sequence about catalyst ideation and so on was the client that I was working with. It was an advertising agency. And so the idea was to do this. So this is the idea of designing conversations for variety. This is one sort of module, let's call it. It's a little crude, but close enough. So that was my first revision. We're replacing observation with understanding who's in the conversation and how we go about designing for variety. Then there's this thing called brainstorming. Brainstorming was very popular, and maybe it still is. The idea that there are no bad ideas, everybody can say anything. And then there's this contradictory research that came along and said, well, you know, brainstorming isn't really as efficient or as effective as you think it is. There are better ways of doing it. I'm sure you're thinking of syntegration. My colleagues and I were looking for a different way of going about it, and that is in the tradition of problem finding. So there's a whole thing here that is part of the design community that I hesitate to go too deeply into. But the point is, if we say, what is the problem, then we've framed it and we're already heading down a path. So we're not in the business as designers anymore of problem solving. We're in the business of problem finding. We look at the situation, and then within that situation, we frame a problem and so on. And one could talk about the history of this out of the school in Ulm, with Wiener going there, Rittel coming out of there, going to Berkeley, et cetera. It's sorry, I have to constrain myself. So what do we mean by a focusing question? It's a subset of all possible things we might wish to brainstorm about. And there are economic, in the case of businesses, think of that as rational potential that we have to think about, the social potential and systemic potential. So finding the focusing question. We can't work on the whole problem. We don't want to work on a problem that's trivial. We want to work on enough that's meaty. And if it's meaty enough, then if we work on that and we get somewhere, then we're on our way toward the broader question. And this is in the paper as linked to there. And then we're in the business of prototyping, which means somehow making something. The word solution here is overly strong, but within the boundary of what we wanted to achieve, there is a kind of answer. And we have to evaluate that as well. We have to measure how that goes. Does it make improvements for stakeholders if we were to build it, or if we do build it as a prototype and we test it? And then we have to understand if we're converging on our design goals. And of course, now here's sort of an intermediate punchline, if you will. What's going on here? All of these three steps now can be construed as conversation to agree on the means of doing what we're trying to do, the actions that we take, the methods that we take. And conversation is the core to this, obviously. And, you know, here on the periphery is this idea of measuring what? Measuring not just how we're doing on what we're doing now, but are we getting toward our design goals? Well, oh, damn it. Wait a minute. Hold it. Goals? Where's goals? I don't see goals here. Forgot about goals. Need to be explicit about goals. So now we're building this framework. We need to agree on the goals as well as agree on the means. And of course, these two things need to be coherent together. Again, there's an iteration and evaluation process. And the coherence that I'm talking about is the conversation to agree on means has to, if we do that, achieve the goals. Simple, right? The goals means have to go together. I could cook up an example, but I think maybe we're okay. So who's in the conversation about goals? Who's in the conversation about means? Where do the participants come from? Well, remember the diagram I showed you a minute ago, where there's a selection mechanism to constantly being vigilant about who do we need in the conversation. Best guess, better than not guessing at all, better than keeping the same established team or group or what have you. So another way to think about this is always asking the question, do we have sufficient variety? So all of these things I'm talking about are conversations to design the designing, right? So the people who are agreeing on goals, that's their job. The people who are agreeing on means, that's their job. And maybe there's an overlap, but there's this other viewpoint, frame, order, looking at what's been going on to design those designings, okay? To design the design of agreeing on goals, etc. I think you get it by now. So I want that to be explicit, and I think models want that to be explicit. I think the VSM is about explicitness as well. So this constant review of variety for all of the pieces is necessary. We come back to add that explicitly, and we are always iterating and evaluating. And the question becomes, what's missing, right? You see where I'm going here. Obviously, there's a lower left block, not a secret. Now, I want to evoke this idea of innovation, one of these words that was great when it first came up and has come to mean almost anything. Again, it's a rant I have to avoid making. But the idea of doing better and not doing a little bit better incrementally on where you are, but doing even significantly, it doesn't really go there, right? Instead of improving the current system, making a new system, let me put it that way. How do we change the system? Not just make it better. And this innovation word haunts every organization, every agency, every government group, and so on. And so how do we get to this innovation thing? And that's what I want to bring in here. What would it mean to add a process here? What is this that makes sure that the others are enabled by innovation when appropriate? We don't need an innovation every half hour, but only when we need a change in the system. So another excursion, we're going to take a little sidebar here, okay? And this work, which again is available as a PDF, was inspired by a colleague, longtime colleague, and colleague still, Michael C. Gagan, some of you know. And this work was designed and managed by Hugh Doverly in a mastermind. The full story is subtle, but I think persuasive. And I think the essence of the story is as follows. We claim, we take the view that an organization is its language. Yeah, there's other stuff going on. There are buildings and so on. People, right? But the organization is what it can and can't do. And this is what I hope to explain very quickly. So who talks to whom about what? And by language, I don't mean English or French. What I mean is, what are the distinctions? What are the relations among those distinctions? Both of which, relations and distinctions, embody value and values. And our language enables us to talk about things. If we don't have a language for it, we can't talk about it. We can't do anything about it. So language is core. And not only can you not talk about it and do something about it, you can't even see it if you don't have the language for it. So point number one. Now, in a business, if you narrow language, you get more efficient. I'm making these cars, it's going really well. In the same way that I want to make the car cheaper, I want to make everything we do more efficient and more streamlined. That's great. That serves efficiency. That serves profit. But the problem is narrowing language increases ignorance. So as the environment changes, this language that was developed to make really great cars in a given market is incapable of seeing changes in the market. There are many examples of this. General Motors here in the States got very famous for making the wrong car cheaper. Bill Gates for many years didn't get the internet. All of a sudden he did. Whoa, and he turned the battleship very quickly. So what do you do about that? If past language limits the future vision because you can't see what changes have occurred and where you might go, then you need to expand language to increase the opportunity. And the final punchline of this segment is to regenerate an organization, you have to create new language, a new set of distinctions, a new set of relations among pre-existing and new distinctions, a new way of seeing, a new way of framing in the design thing. So this box, this mysterious box, becomes a conversation to create new language. Okay, so thank you. You've been very patient. So this elegant work of design and such an influential thing, the viable system model, has, I don't need to tell you, had great influence, explanatory power, and so on. But, you know, I'm over here working on this little way of thinking about it. And then there's this, there's the VSM. So my offer to you today is, if you see any merit in what I've been describing, then help me to understand, is this a mismatch? Are there ways of entering the VSM from this point of view? Are there ways of amplifying, perhaps, one set of ideas or the other? We often talk about cybernetics as this field that's, you know, a bunch of ideas over here and a bunch of ideas over there, and where's the unity and where's the... How do we influence the world better from these cybernetic ideas? So maybe this could go there. Now, let me propose to you what I think this relationship is, and please correct me. Very likely incorrect. I'm new to the VSM relatively, even having known Stafford all this time. I've read some of the books and so on, but you are the experts. That's how I think about it. So let's look at these three systems, 3, 4, and 5, and ask the question where my little blue squares might fit. So this is system 3. Inside and now. I love that way of putting it. Actually, let me grab. As I said, Angela kindly lent me some of her upcoming texts. System 3 is aware of what is going on inside and now in the present time, represents different types of managerial functions, including those managing people, financial resources, infrastructure, and technology. That feels to me like the conversations to agree on means. There are actions too, conversations for action, cybernetics as conversations for action. And I think, again, you know, system 1 and 2 are part of the means. That's where the operations are actually regulated, as I understand it. So this is one beginning map. System 4, the seat of strategy, as articulated by Angela. And I'm sure, you know, as she says all the time, adapted from Beer here. Develop and maintain an updated model of the total viable system, a model of the unknown future. Typically, system 4 includes roles responsible for exploring new products and services, new production of service processes, new technologies, new markets, new organizational development. This feels to me like conversation to agree on goals. System 5, identity, policy, coherence. This feels to me where designing the designing and creating new language comes along. So identity enclosure, that's not a static thing, right? That is an evolving thing. And as the environment changes, the organism of the organization has to evolve in order to remain viable. And so this is where the new language becomes required. So there's one more thing, which is, of course, as you know, these structures are fractal. And as you also know, Stafford was a devotee of autopoiesis. He wrote a very early preface to one of the writings on that. So this triple, if you will, or four in the case of my squares, repeats at various levels. This is a passing comment on it. So just to close, and then I'd like to come back to that diagram and then open it up for discussion and critique. This model, this four-square model, is really considering design as conversation, which is the foundation. It's Ranulph, it's what we talked about earlier. And at another layer, it's conversations for variety, and lest we forget, variety and action. So again, from this paper with Doverly, we construe design as a conversation for action, that is, as cybernetics, and action may either conserve or change a situation. You recognize that. In other words, design is a conversation about what to conserve and what to change, a conversation about what to value, what we value. And this, of course, is pure Maturana. One of the great quotes of Maturana is, "The only thing peculiar to us, in contrast to other living beings, is that we human beings consciously choose the path we follow in the conservation of our living. And we are therefore responsible for what we choose." The word choose. The wicked problems of the world, you know. These are not simple or complex problems. Forgive one more slide. The goal of second order design, designing for conversation, is to facilitate the emergence of conditions in which others can design. And that's what this four-square model promotes. So how do you create conditions in which conversations can emerge and thus increase the number of choices open to all? Again, the notion of choice. And of course, you recognize that from Heinz. I shall act always so as to increase the total number of choices. And that is what I wish to say. Thank you for your patience. I don't know whether there's anything to go back to in the chat, but I would prefer to make it live. How about if I stop sharing to be more convivial and then open conversation? If others would like to begin, you can raise your hand and I can moderate that way. May I here also to moderate.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. I think we can open the floor for questions. We have Kirk and then Catherine.
Hi, yes. I wonder if you could more clearly articulate what you mean by the evaluate and the iterate. Because in one sense, I thought of that as evaluate is about feeling what ought to be most valuable or significant. And then the other hand, I thought, well, maybe you mean we're thinking about it, or maybe you mean we're choosing it. And then, so recursive, what? Can you be more clear about those?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a great question. The basic idea is that I'm in a situation where I've done something. Think of it as a first order loop. I've done something. Did I do better or worse than I did before? It's really that simple. So what are my criteria for evaluating whether or not I'm doing the right thing? It's that simple. And again, my suggestion is that if you look into the design thinking materials, at least those I've seen, there are many, I don't hear enough about how it is you go about this iteration. They talk a lot about iteration, but I don't hear the specifics of what the development of evaluative criteria, whatever they may be quantitative, qualitative. But where am I? How do I do better? I mean, to put it in a silly way, I got a thermostat. I want the temperature to be a certain temperature. Have I gotten there? No. Okay, well, I better keep acting. Am I converging toward what I want? Am I diverging away from what I want? These kinds of things. So I don't mean anything more complex or mystical than that. Does that answer that, Kurt? Great, thank you. Catherine.
Thank you very much for the talk. I am also new to this space. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And I started my work in complexity, jumping out of genetic engineering and into political science as a pre-grad. So I sort of jumped into the fire immediately, and quite late in my career got to know Elena and found out in my PhD, I discovered Stapler and I said, oh, that's very complicated. I'm not going to touch it. But I worked with other topics. One issue that comes up in listening to your lovely presentation for me is the question of, yeah, conversation is very important. So I'm asking myself, how do you define conversation? Are you using, for example, something that comes out of Douglas and Walensky that's saying, everything I do is, all of my actions are forms of expressing. And where are those boundaries that you put on conversation? Is it the purposive act of sitting down at a table and having a dialogue? Does it extend out to implicit structural framing? I think that's very important because in my limited understanding of integration and the BSM, there is this complex system dynamic that the manifestation, the physical realization of a purposive system is one of the things that constrains the functioning of that purposive system. So it's an error to look at this as up-down or down-up. It's rather this creative tension. And in that respect, the physical configuration and a lot of social structuration that's not necessarily spoken is quite important. And I'm wondering, where do you place that inside of your ontologies?
Thank you for the question. My shorthand was inadequate and I knew it. I was referring to Pask's view of conversation. It's compatible with Stafford's idea that a conversation is something from which you change. Right? The quote is roughly, if you don't get information, if you haven't changed, you didn't get any information. An effective conversation is one in which one or more participants evolves in their thinking. This would be my starting point. And Pask talked about many other aspects. There are other experts in this call who can speak to those others, but my interest is, what is the exchange of ideas such that the mental shared models evolve? And in particular, in designing, those models are effective ways of seeing, not objectively, no such thing, sorry, but rather ways of framing and seeing in order to parse the space such that action can be taken and that action will be effective toward the goals that are stated. And the goals are also stated in language. So that would be my circumscription of the word conversation in this case. I hope that's sufficient. It may not be satisfying, I can see, but this is how I would frame that. Thank you. Stephen?
Thank you, Paul. You've been elaborating conversations for action, and when you look into the language action perspective, there's a typology of conversations that includes conversations for disclosure, as well as conversations for possibility.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you would include, you're intending to be inclusive of all three types of conversations, because I would see conversations for possibility very much living in system 4, And I would see conversations for disclosure, authentic disclosure in meaningful relationships as essential to all of the underlying elements of conversation, so that people can presence themselves, fully and integrally. So I just wondered, could you say a little bit about that? And then I do have one suggestion for you in terms of
Please.
What you've posited as the conversation to create new language. I'm not sure that resides in System 5.
Okay.
I think that might reside right in the center of the System 3-4 homeostat, where the new possibilities for the future include new possibilities for language and identity and are brought into the System 3 world for negotiation and contemplation and acceptance. And then if there is a chord in that 3-4 homeostat, then System 5 would step in and essentially bless it as the new identity. At least that's my conceptioning around what you're offering today. And I just want to say I've followed your work now for several years. And when you spoke at RSD 5 and subsequent RSD conferences, I just love the way that this material has developed and enriched over the last 5, 6, 7 years. It's really fabulous.
Thank you, Stephen. That's very generous of you, and I appreciate very much the critique that you're proposing. I would love to pursue that. To your question, I confess that I think of a conversation for possibilities as primary and encompassing. I don't know the specific typology you're talking about. I should look at it perhaps. But that's the whole point about conversation, and that's what other situations don't allow, is this opening of possibilities. I most apply the idea of disclosure or transparency in working in interaction design, where I have a response to almost every recommendation engine and most of the AI systems that are online in the big platform companies, where they give you an option. They say, you want this? Oh, you don't want that? Okay. You want this? Oh, you do want it? Okay, fine. And that's the extent of the agency that the human is. So I want transparency of why the offering is being made. And also I want a conversational capability such that if the user wants to interrogate why that is being offered, the transparent and honest response is there. And if the human says, okay, great, I trust you, go ahead, that's okay too. I'm not trying to force the human to always get a justification, although that might be better than the other way around. So for better or worse, conversation enables possibility, and lack of conversation is the denial of possibility. And I often say, maybe it's going a little too far afield, but if I have a conversation with you and I see possibilities I didn't see, then I can go from who I am to who I might become. And that opening out is, I think, primary. And that's another reason to hammer at the very end this idea of second order design, enabling possibilities in others by enabling conversations in the situations that they're in. And that's, in a sense, the foundation of my interest.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Hello, Jamie.
Hi, Paul. Wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you. I'm concerned, and I have been from my own viewpoint from the integrity paradigm, notions of homeostasis as being too dominant among these things, because variety, and especially the expansion of Ashby's requisite variety, is really critically important for living systems and even human systems as not artificial, but as an extension of the natural world. So the tendency towards the conflict of wanting to stability and consistency versus the explorations which variety really honors and encourages, gets to be a challenging set of how to handle things. I just appreciate a comment on that.
Are you suggesting that I'm emphasizing homeostasis?
No, I'm not at all. I'm because that came up as, the stage 5 part, and it's a dominant part of the VSM thesis. And I've always been dealing with it as a conflict issue in my biology basis of organizations. So it's a socially and culturally, it's something to deal with. For a group that wants to maintain certain policies and goals, I'm glad you really got around to mentioning that. Not being resistant to change is what, but yet variety is what it encourages. Okay, I'll let you reply.
So I think we're resonant with each other on that idea.
Right.
I'm also worried about homeostasis implying a return back and a resistance to change. The whole idea of opening possibilities and creating new language is to recognize when the return to the prior homeostatic state is not a good thing, because it's not going to let you go to where you want to go or to become or to succeed in the environment, which has changed to such a degree that if you don't change, you're going to lose.
And evolve.
Oh, yeah. Yes. No. I
Yeah, no.
apologize for not being able to add to that. I think you're right. And homeostasis is a trap in the same way that just the first order loop is a trap. That's not the whole story. So in the same way that loops within loops afford the ability to change the set points or the goals of the interior loops, the question is, who's changing the outer loops? What is changing the outer loops such that you're not stuck?
I'm very glad you made this the frame of reference to bring to everyone's attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Bernard?
Yeah, hi. I would like to offer a perspective from an experience of working with practitioners. And I'm sure you also realize that I find it's always, when you look at, in my case, managers, but let's put it like that, people who have left academia and have maybe slightly different interests, it's always a decision to make whether we want to lead them into the world of the VSM explicitly and let them absorb it and understand it and then make it part of their own ways of working, or whether we just translate our understanding of it into the context that as we see it and just give them the results of our thinking. Because they are not capable of making that other step. They're it's too abstract, too theoretical, and so on. Now, from these kinds of people, I very much like when you said, you immediately focused on systems 3, 4, and 5 in your looking for connections, and then you said, let's see how you can take this into the VSM. What if you don't take it into the VSM, but kind of make a detour and take bits out of the VSM to land somewhere in a third place? Now, how could that work? Well, I have experience of this kind of translating elements of VSM thinking into practical context where people are actually capable of doing that, is taking exactly the thinking of systems 3, 4, and 5 and translating that into the metaphor of hats, so that you put on different hats while you're having your conversations. And I see also the relation to some of your boxes that you made in your presentation, so that you have this kind of inside and now hat, you have maybe more looking outwards, outside and then hat. And especially what I found the most valuable was the System 5 hat, in the sense of, well, you say design the design, exactly this sense of organizing, the general rules according to which we work and so on and so forth, which is always a step change when you look at the nature of conversations. And the step change that I observe, that people often are not, have difficulties of consciously going. They always fall back on the object level. If you want to put it simply, it's kind of going on a meta level and staying there, and people kind of come back on the object level. And they always make the example that if we have at home a conflict because yesterday the garbage hasn't been taken out, and some of the people, or some of the two spouses probably, one of them has this idea of the discussion is about whose turn was it yesterday to take out the garbage. And the other person's perspective is, what is the rule really of how we organize taking out the garbage, and why are you always not following the rule? Then we have a conversation on two different levels, which usually only can end up badly. And so clarifying that and understanding, especially now in my case, management teams, but I think it could apply also for design teams, kind of, when you have a meeting, for example, separating it. What is the System 3 hat kind of part of the meeting? When do we switch, and what rules changes? And by doing that, we are in the System 5 hat already. What rules changes when we go into the System 4 hat? How do we have different roles, different ways of communication? And of course, that kind of discussion, how do we organize these communications? How do we organize our various perspectives would be a System 5 hat, which we take on maybe occasionally or only. And this metaphor of the hats was one way that I realized was very successful in translating that, so that even practitioners could then start, okay, let's organize our meeting with these kinds of hats.
Beautiful. I think the hats is a great metaphor for what you want to do and taking on the different roles. I'm very sympathetic to your earliest point, which is there's a certain complexity involved in understanding the VSM or conversation theory or ideas from cybernetics that come out of their own language and out of their own complexity. Let me sort of cut to the chase and say, in the work I'm doing with some colleagues here in the so-called New Macy endeavor, we've moved from saying, we know things, come to us, to the point of us wanting to be accessible to others in their context, in their language, in what they're doing. And the metaphor for this is a free service. In America, we have a 1-800 number from the times when long distance calls were expensive. So you call 1-800-CYBERNET, and we can then understand as best we can what you're interested in and bring you the resources and bring the resources to you. So this is one answer. In general, with what I'll be doing here at Carnegie Mellon, it's a wonderful opportunity to do these kinds of things, is to create a colloquium, which instead of saying, hello world, at our age and with our wisdom, we know what you need, let us bring you this knowledge. But instead saying, looking at junior faculty and students and saying, what are the problems you're interested in? And then ask them to say how they see their problems, and then come meet them in those places where we feel that there might be concepts or models or whatever that could be of use to them. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not a paternalistic view, but rather a collaborative or a co-creationist view. I appreciate your courage in going into organizations and wanting to bring the arsenal of VSM with you. And I agree that you're probably doing it in the most effective way, which is not by cramming into them what is this, prior framework. I'm sure you follow a lot of the organizational design stuff that's out there on social media and so on. And very often, here's the book, here are the 4 steps, you're done. And I agree with you shaking your head.
Just as an add-on, I've put a link in the chat. A friend of mine, Ralph Türke in Switzerland, he works very much on that level of translating things. He comes from the University of St. Gallen, and he's a VSM specialist more than I am. And that might be an interesting part to look at also, to look how to design a more fluid organization by translating some VSM knowledge into exactly a language that is relatable.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. Thank you. Elena.
Thank you for a lovely talk. Relating to the concept of homeostasis, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the bridge between recursions and how that works in these conversations.
The bridge between recursions. So I would interpret that question to be about how is it instrumented?
Yeah, I think my example is based on working with in some situations where the right decision to maintain, viability, et cetera, at one recursion is actually antithetical to the next level of recursion up. So there has to be a space for conversation about how you reorient, priorities, possibilities, and what have you, and particularly when there's been a change in the environment that leaves different alternatives open, but not the one that is currently being used.
You're suggesting a path that I haven't had the opportunity to think about at a meta level. I'm more in the academic world now, although I've spent years doing organizational consulting, perhaps likely not to the degree that others who have spoken, Bernard, for example. And I haven't thought about how to formalize that. This is a path that I think would be appropriate. So I have my boxes, but when does one box influence the other box more than operate on its own, is I think what you're asking. What are the interconnections? What are the linkages?
Yeah, what are the linkages? Sometimes the linkages are between the different systems, like system 4 at one level of recursion, talking to system 4 at a level of recursion up and a level of recursion down.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes the choices and the options are going to look a lot different.
Yes.
And the answer to a question that everyone considers to be a common question might also differ as you go to a more or less comprehensive view of the situation.
Yes, I'm a student here, Elena. I appreciate your comments. I can't respond specifically because I haven't operated at that meta level yet in this model, but a path which I appreciate.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for the original invitation to come.
Very happy you could come.
So much. Raghav?
Thank you. Well, thank you for an extremely elegant presentation. And I am not much clued into either design thinking or VSM, some outside kind of view of it. But so I'm going to be struggling a bit to articulate my question, but it is something like this. I mean, I see that potency and power in design thinking from whatever little I know, and also in VSM. And I know, I mean, even as I listen to you, and I resonate with this idea that we're looking to expand the space, to evolve our thinking, to expand the mental frames, is about touching generativity, touching creativity. But the moment we talk about our wicked problems, and especially in the context of today's, meta wicked problems, it frightens me when we do not talk about, things like what we cannot know, what we cannot ever know, or what we cannot act upon, or whether there are things that we can count on for forces larger than us to respond to, because we are in the iteration, we are in the middle, and we are not in the outermost sort of shell or whatever. So that's only the kind of caution, or I don't know whether caution is the word. That's a kind of doubt I have about what we're trying to address.
Beautiful. Thank you for your comment. I think the last thing you said is extraordinarily important. I find myself often saying to students, of course, you need to know what your design does address, but more important is to know what it does not address. So I concur completely with that idea. And in the context of wicked problems, or a new phrase that you've just suggested, which I like, meta wicked problems, it's like, well, it's only getting worse. How do we deal with that? This idea of admission of, well, of course, we don't want to admit that, right? We come from the Enlightenment, we come from, rationalism, we can do it all. We can overcome anything. And then optimism is, and arrogance has put us in, or some of the optimism and arrogance are some of the elements that have put us in this nasty state that we're in. So certainly a recognition of that arrogance and the limitations of that is very, very important. I don't know how to change a culture which feels that it's all dominant and can do whatever it wishes to do.
Yes, but a little sort of insight into that from the way I have tried to work in organizational consulting is that we do our diagnosis and our mapping, but in trying to open the minds of the people within the system to appreciating that, what I have often done is I have used theater. I have used activities from theater. So very quickly, for example, to give an example, if I find two major axes of polarization in an organization between, the original goals of the founder and, sort of changing ambitions of a new set, or between, certain things, previous technology and some new technology or something like that, then I map that onto the floor of the room by speaking from different vertices, and then ask people to assume positions on that in that space according to that map, and speak from their locations as to why they are there and how do they see things, and then have conversations. And that so things where we used arts-based methods of various sorts. These are the ways to go, even within our not knowing. I mean, there are things that we know that we do not know, and how to bring that out. I think going beyond the rational conversations, that's an area to work with.
It's a lovely idea to use theater and to ask people to take different roles, and then to see from a different frame to change their positions.
Right.
And to have a completely different experience, and to think of that as a theatrical play in more than one sense. It's a lovely mechanism, and pulling them out of the assurance of where they start from, and giving them a different. It sounds very nice. Great, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Di?
Hi, thanks very much. I found that really useful.
Thank you.
Looking around the world, I see lots of pathological conversations.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, presumably in Ford, there were pathological conversations going on, which made it impossible for them to work out that they were getting the answer wrong about their cheap, wrong car. And, we got the climate conference going on now, and there's a conversation happening there which seems to be incapable of finding any kind of answer. So it seems to me that among the things that are happening here are kind of pressures from outside which are distorting the conversation. People feel that they can say some things, but they can't say other things, or that if they say something, then the meaning is contextualized by somebody outside. And then other actors may be disguising their actual sabotage of the conversation. So something's happening which is intended to destroy the conversation. So my question is really, do we need some kind of tools to diagnose these things when they're happening and to decide some action? Because after all, those are kind of VSM-like questions which we might ask about the conversation. What's happening around it, which we need to adapt to, and how can we do it? I'm almost thinking of a kind of therapy for conversations here. In crisis, what do we do? So I don't know. That's my thought.
It's a lovely reflection. Thank you very much. I loved your point that there are pressures of what not to say. I think we see that all the time in politics. Certainly in America, we're not allowed to say a lot of things, including whether COVID is a problem or not, or whether long COVID is a problem, all those kinds of issues. You said something about finding any kind of answer. And I don't know if you meant it in the literal sense, but I think, again, so this is a matter of language, answers, problems, solutions, ways forward. So thank you for allowing me to quibble a little bit with that. I like the idea of therapy for conversations. or attention to look at conversations and to understand which ones are working and which ones are not in a specific way in a specific organization. And of course, there you have all of the politics and hierarchy and all of the other issues there. There's a broad set of suggestions there, Di, which I like a lot. I don't have good answers for them, but thank you for raising them. Thanks.
If I may jump in for a moment there. See, I've had experience with a form of group inquiry that we have developed in India that originated from the T group approach, but it has taken completely its own cultural and I mean Indian kind of approach. So I mean it's not confrontationist, it's now sort of invitational and so on. And there we very clearly have this understanding of the process of the group dynamics and how it's going. And one of the things that's very clear is that if we enter forbidden territory, there is every likelihood that processes would collude, somebody in the group would bring in either humor or something or the other to divert from the discomfort that's developing. And so as a bunch of facilitators who moderate such conversations, we are sort of alive to and alert to that. And we remark on that process that's happening and ask the group to reflect. So that's a kind of second order cybernetic approach. And that is very, very effective. But to cap that, what we have discovered is that it is much more effective to go beyond the spoken word, beyond conversations, and to work through, modalities like art and theater and yoga and so on, to open these spaces.
Wonderful. I'd love to
discomfort for inquiry.
Thank you very much. I'd love to learn more about some of the specifics of that. If you have anything you might share, let me share.
I will do that. I will do that offline sometime. Yes.
Thank you, Rita. And for everyone, I've put my email and also the link to the slides that I've been using in the chat, if that's of use to you. Robert.
Yeah, the very, very useful, very, very interesting. Really enjoyed it. I loved that second question. Who do we need to be part of this conversation? We've got this small group and we're talking, but now when we've got into these issues, who do we need to be part of that conversation? So that was very important for me. The other thing, of course, is thinking about the whole thing as conversation, because for me, cybernetics is about control. Cybernetic systems are control systems.
What do you mean
by control? I mean the ability, power in a communication system is the ability to make a decision. So cybernetics is about decision making. So that when you talk about conversations coming to an agreement, there are ways we come to agreement in a conversation. The classic one being, you call me captain, you call everybody else boss. So yeah, that's one kind of agreement. But communication is itself a kind of harmonizing. We're trying to translate what the person is saying into something that makes sense to us and giving feedback so that what we're saying can make sense to them. And when you talk about dysfunctional conversations, like one of the dysfunctions we're watching at the moment is, of course, the idea that you prevent conversations, that you act to prevent any kind of conversation from happening, and then you prevent any ideas, you prevent any agreement, you prevent peace. Anyway, great presentation, loved it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Robert. Much appreciated. Elena.
I was trying to lower my hand.
Oh, I see. Okay. Fine. Great. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, here. My
Hello.
name is Yes, my name is Marcus, and I'm sorry you can't see me because my camera is defect. But I would like to get back to the arguments about applications of the VSM, especially with practitioners. And I would like to challenge the argument that we should use surrogate models, simplified models, etc., because the VSM is supposed to be too sophisticated. Let me say that an application of VSM first agrees about the frame of reference used in a conversation. And you have to agree on that before. You have to agree in what language are we speaking, what code are we using. And it's such a code, such a language that enables transdisciplinary conversation. That's something that goes beyond interdisciplinary because everyone links themselves to a common frame of reference. And so if we translate to surrogate component or approaches, we trivialize the whole the model and the process. So and I also think that it's arrogant to treat participants as if they couldn't understand the model. That's absolutely not the case. Well, here are some people who have done projects with practitioners many years ago. Alena Leonard. I did a project with Raoul in the 80s where we explained the model to those people and they very well understood it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, very much. I think Bernard, who had made some of the comments, is no longer here, although I would invite him back if he wants to come. I didn't understand.
I am still here, Paul.
Oh, no, sorry, Bernard, different Bernard.
Oh, the other one. Okay, I'll go away again.
No, but I'd love to hear you make some comments. Maybe.
No, I'm still here. No,
Thank you very much.
I've got someone here buying a guitar, so.
Thank you, Bernard. What I understood the other Bernard to say, two comments in response, Marcus. Thank you for your intervention. One was not that it was an oversimplification, but rather it was a way of finding a common ground that the other side in the conversation could begin from without perceiving the situation to be so complex as to be overwhelming. Now, I might agree with you that we shouldn't think that others can't understand it, but I think he was speaking in a shorthand more in regard to how I just characterized it. So I'm not disagreeing with you other than to say that I don't think his goal was to simplify or to denigrate the others, but rather to find a way of reaching people who, may I say it this way, refuse to enter the complexity. Any response, Marcus?
Thank you, that's fine.
Okay, great, thank you so much. John Lee, do I have your name right?
Yes, thank you. I'll just say that I spent 30 years in local politics here in Davis, California, trying to explain my ideas without explaining BSM. So in 2010, I ran for city council on the second time. I'd run in 96 on healthcare and local economics. So in 2010, I ran specifically with the agenda of getting BSM in the local newspaper 100 times, and I got it in 50 times. Now I came in fourth or fifth. I mean, my agenda was not to get elected, it was to learn how to explain BSM to people. And I learned that during that process. So I'm simultaneously in Bernard's camp and in Marcus's camp. I love the power of BSM. I'm very quick to say I don't understand all of it. I'm very quick to say I'm a system scientist who's learning BSM, but it's a very useful communication tool because when somebody knows you're talking about BSM System 3 and BSM System 4, and they know what the difference is, you can have a very powerful conversation about the here and now and about where you want to go and how to get there and what your vision of a VSM4 model is. So to have the language is the beginning to empower having the dialogue. Now, number two is 50% of the people in the United States do not believe in evolution. That means that to get them to talk about any change at all is a violation of their basic principles. So you have to start where they are. And if you start by saying, look, I want to talk about social change, you're in trouble to begin with. You have to start out wherever they are and find common ground. Getting to the BS. So I'll just end with this example. I met a student. He was Hispanic from Vacaville. I interviewed him. I laid out all of his system 1s. Then I explained what his system 3 was. Then I explained his system 4 and his system 5. And then I went home and got the graphic. And he was blown away that I had built the graphic around his life. And that's what you can do with Elena's BSM model of the personal BSM, along with the guide by John Walker. That's the 2 tools you need to make the transition, but you need to start wherever the people are. You can't, the biggest problem I have is I'm in the biological campus of at least the Northern universe. So when I show them BSM, they immediately think of a cell. And I go, stop, time out. This is something completely different than a cell. We're not talking about a nucleus. Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you so much.
Oh, I have one last thing. My response to Elena's question is system 1, system 5, that's your layers, and it's a system 3 and system 4 that are making the transition in the here and now and negotiating about the future. That's a recursion from one level to the next, because the next level up, the 5 is the system 1. Now that's just the textbook example. How you make it work. I love the idea that I think Bernard had about the hats, of saying, okay, I'm taking off my system 4 hat now and I'm putting on my system 5 hat. I am now your boss. I'm making the decision. Now we're going to have to live with that. Okay, now I'm back to system 4. What do you want to do?
Okay, understood about that comment. Just a brief comment about your first remark. I think I agree in general. I said before, I think we have to start where others are. I don't know how that means you introduce VSM first. It may mean you introduce VSM early, but also I think we have to recognize that different people learn in different ways and have different learning styles. And therefore some might immediately be attracted to an abstraction or a model or a diagram of what their world is as formulated by you, and others would need to be brought forward in other ways. Yeah, thank you. Hello, Mike V, is that who that is?
Hi, Paul.
Hi there.
How are you?
Okay. Thank
Yes.
you.
First, practical question, Paul. Is Colloquy of Mobile still on display in ZKM in Karlsruhe?
No, unfortunately, it's been pulled down because the exhibition ended, but we're in the process of trying to fix it well enough so that it can be loaned to others.
Okay.
So thank you for asking.
Okay. Well, then, to other business for today. I think it would be more potent to look at mappings between conversation theory and integration.
Ah.
That's not really a question, that's more a statement.
Yes.
Which hasn't, I think, at any significance really taken place in history.
I agree. Yeah.
And which would also, I think, be really interesting if you would like to explore integrations online and distributed, asynchronous.
Yes. Yes, that would be of interest, and certainly a comparison of the two approaches. I don't know how they intersect. I can't think about it yet, but perhaps some workshopping of this integration idea with a lens of conversation theory might be appropriate to that. In fall of 2023, I expect to create a colloquium around some things. I don't want to dive into that now, but we want to do it hybrid, and we'd be interested in any mechanisms that would help that. So perhaps we can return to that.
Okay.
Great. I invite you to be in touch. That'd be wonderful.
Come to Brussels.
Ah, well, that would be the greatest temptation. Thank you. Thank you very much, man. Raul?
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation. I the first question I have is, are you saying that conversations are the way to construct organizations? Is that the emphasis that you wanted to give?
Yes, I haven't made that sentence in my head, but I don't disagree with it. I would say that the organization is its language and its capacity to have conversations. And if if you can't talk about it, you can't do anything about it, and maybe you can't even see it. So that for me and colleagues is foundation.
Right. The point I want to make is that conversation and structure are very much intertwined.
Agreed.
And therefore, structure is something that we have to pay attention all the time in order to build up our goals, our aims, or whatever.
Good. But
sorry, I haven't finished. If I may. The point I want to make is that you have made a connection of systems 3, 4, and 5, and essentially the process of creating something for the organization. The point I wanted to make is, have you made any connection between these 3, 4, 5 and the requisite variety? I didn't see a good deal of a connection that coming from you and that's where structure comes, because the structure is precisely how is it that the systems 3, 4, and 5 come together to generate a purpose that in a way is the one that the organization will develop and construct for the future. So that would be my main question in a way.
Yes.
Requisite variety, structure, and purpose.
Thank you. Inside of my comments about variety, but insufficiently stated, I agree, is the evaluation function, which is an evaluation of whether we've achieved requisite variety in any given place. So every time I said variety, it's a search for requisite variety, and the evaluative function is intended to be that monitoring to see whether or not you're approaching it. That would be one response. My other response is, you said conversation and structure. And my response to that is, where does structure come from except from conversation? It arises as a result of our agreements, which then enable us to act in a coordinated way, which results in structure. So I'm not denying that structure is valuable, but I think what your comment says doesn't deny the primacy of conversation as the initiator.
I wouldn't deny at all the primacy of conversation. That's clearly there. But the point is that when you have an organization which has some particular structure, that is going to enhance or inhibit the generation of policies, of capacity to move ahead in the organization. And that's what I didn't see in the way you presented the 3, 4, 5 connection.
That's fair enough. Your knowledge obviously is vastly greater than mine in VSM and 3, 4, 5. I'm new to wanting to make this analogy, and I appreciate your comments, and I'll take them into account. Thank you.
Paul, if I may add something, in your original concept, where there's context as the second part of conversation, where there's the point when to start a conversation and when to stop a conversation. This would be the cybernetical point where context becomes part of a conversation, and where you also have to differentiate what is means and what is context, because the means is the environment out of what the context is the environment out of which means emerge, and there's a transformation between both, and there's always this poetic choice that Wittgenstein puts so exactly, points out so exactly. In life as in art, it is difficult to say anything that is better than saying nothing. So there's always that poetic choice, whether it increases something to say something, whether the rhythm of a conversation is disrupted or increased by saying something or not. And this is something you have to make a strategic choice in the organization, and that will create the values. And that's in your second point of how to construct a cybernetic conversation. I didn't see that. Maybe if you put your original structure, how a conversation is structured in it, then you have it.
Thank you. That's a lovely comment, Lucas. I appreciated it. Lucas is in part of what he's saying, referring to a model which I've extracted from Pask's conversation theory, which begins from the idea of context. But your point that the context is made as a consequence of the agreements that come around and then bring structure to what's going on is, I think, a really wonderful point. So thank you for that. And also your reference to the poetic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Catherine, we have a few more minutes left. I don't know if it's a firm close. I will defer to Maya and Elena.
We have about 4 minutes. So
no, I think I will leave my question and then maybe Paul make his final comments. So I don't want to answer the question. I wasn't looking at the time. I was just interested in the conversation. So
Didn't mean to.
John wants my comment. I'll make it very shortly, John. My comment is just that I think the application in business and the application in society are distinct.
Mm-hmm.
And in that respect, the assumption of consensus, agreement, or mutual orientation that underpins the way in which you're describing conversation, I think is something that needs to be thought about very differently in a broader social context. And I would mention it just because wicked problems often throw us into conditions where science and society, private enterprise, impacted communities. One that's a big issue for me is deforestation in the Amazon, for example. But there are a lot of others that are very similar, where these fine lines between the purpose of the company, the purpose of society, and the purpose of the biological systems are not so easy to manage. Sorry, you have 3 minutes left to say something impactful and interesting, Paul.
No, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for your comments and also your comments in the chat, which I'm not fully able to digest, of course. Raul, you had another comment?
Yeah, it's more a contribution than a question. I have just published 2 papers related to conversations and the VSM. And they may be of interest to you and to anybody else. The one is Maturana's path of objectivity in parentheses in the Journal of Cybernetics and Knowledge and Knowing. So that's one contribution, and the other contribution is the cybernetics of organization and institutions with reference to the problems, the geopolitical problems that you find today with global and local situations. That's what I call the Westphalian dilemma. And that has also been published recently, and it somehow explains the connection between structure and conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raul.
okay, well, that was a very lively discussion and definitely an inspiring presentation. Thank you all for attending. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you all.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you in the next Meta Forum.
Wonderful. All best. Stay safe.
Thank you, Paul. It was great.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.